Hi, this is Paul. This will be a little random for some of you, but I wanted to make a video about Jon Stewart. Now, Stewart was one of the very big names in political comedy. Just recently, Bill Maher was on Ben Shapiro's show. I watched that. I'd followed Bill Maher from when he was on ABC TV on his show Politically Incorrect. I always enjoyed the fact that he had a diversity of people from a religious and political background on for honest conversation. And I really enjoyed that show. And I didn't have HBO until I just not too long ago got my cell phone on AT&T. And then, of course, you get HBO Max thrown in. So even now, I don't watch Bill Maher's show very often. I usually catch little clips of it on YouTube. Jordan Peterson, of course, was on Bill Maher's show. But this generation of individuals, Bill Maher, Jon Stewart, are in some ways sort of proto IDW. And Stewart is born the same year as Jordan Peterson, a year before me, grew up in the New York metropolitan area. Actually has a rather interesting bio. He was born Jonathan Stewart Leibowitz in November of 1962. His father was an energy coordinator for the New Jersey Department of Treasury. Stewart's family, members of the Jewish immigrants to America in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. One of his grandfathers was born in Marzahul, now part of Inner Mongolia. His parents divorced when he was 11 years old. He was largely estranged from his father because of his strained relationship with his father, which in 2015 he describes as still complicated. He dropped his surname and began using the name Stewart. Notes in the Wikipedia article, Stewart grew up during the era of the Vietnam War and Watergate scandal, which inspired him to a healthy skepticism towards official reports. Now, Stewart is back on, has a new show, The Problem with Jon Stewart. And I didn't know this because I don't have Apple TV either. And I don't really want to subscribe to Apple TV just to see how much of this one show I watch. But like many other things on other streaming TVs, they have snippets and extras and a bunch of things on YouTube. And so I've actually been watching a bunch of his YouTube stuff. But I got into it because I started watching this program, What Happened to Jon Stewart, a retrospective, in which this is from Skip Intro. The video came out March 2 this year. And for some strange reason, the algorithm sent me to this video. And I actually found the video very interesting because during the Second Iraq War, I watched a fair amount of Jon Stewart. And one of the things that I'm seeing is that in some ways the Second Iraq War was a crisis in sense-making for a whole nother generation. And this is sort of where Jon Stewart and Rod Dreher and let's say Damon Linker and maybe Andrew Sullivan all sort of come together. It's this generation of people who were just at the end of the baby boom, just at the beginning of the Xers, having experienced the 1970s and remembering it, known Watergate and Vietnam to a degree, have a degree of skepticism about sense-making through the media. And in looking through some of Stewart's clips, I find this to be a very regular topic that he takes up. So this is one of the videos that he posted, and he has a professor from academia to talk about disinformation and misinformation. But what comes up pretty quickly here is the Second Iraq War and the WMDs. And now I'm going to play another video, which is a commentary on Jon Stewart, where basically a millennial is complaining about him that, well, we'll get to that complaint first, but let's just get a sense of Stewart. Now, I'm not going to play the video as such here because then I can't YouTube won't let me, basically. But I will play the audio, and I'll just kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the frame.
I might just be a bad actor, but not even know that I'm spreading misinformation. I'm just hitting retweet.
But that's the, like, my uncle said it on Facebook.
And the topic here is Joe Rogan and the media. Now, Stewart sort of stepped out of line with a whole bunch of people, and this is why usually certain millennials and younger are having a problem with Jon Stewart. The name of his new show is, in fact, The Problem with Jon Stewart, because Stewart is a friend of Joe Rogan, and Stewart really sort of stood up to defend Joe Rogan, and of course, that will not be tolerated to one degree or another. So they're going to get into it with this professor, and very quickly you'll see where the conversation goes.
Kind of excuse, right? He's spreading misinformation.
Right.
What changes it for someone like Rogan is it's his brand. It's controversy is his brand. Controversial conversations is what Spotify paid $100 million for. Right. And Spotify wants to reject the fact that they're a publisher. And in this moment of the digital revolution that we're going through, to call yourself a platform actually means a very specific thing. Where Spotify wants all the benefits of being called a platform, where there's a lot of user-generated content, which creates a lot of chaos and opportunities for disinformation and misinformation. But they really knew what they were getting. All of these problems were there when Rogan was primarily using YouTube as a means to gather an audience.
So here's where I run into trouble, and here's why I believe. Well, first of all, I know Joe. So I think you always grant more understanding and nuance to people you know, because you know them as more three-dimensionally than what that appearance is. So, and we always demonize those that we maybe feel alien to us. So that goes right in there. I'm already guilty.
And it goes both ways. We push away those that we wish to demonize.
Of a bias, right? Mm-hmm. But the second part of it, where I run into trouble, is the thing you just said. You talked about they want the benefit, but they don't want the accountability. And you mentioned weapons of mass destruction. And it reminded me, like, the New York Times, right, was a giant purveyor of misinformation and disinformation. I don't know that the Times was purposeful, but misinformation. And that's as vaunted a media organization as you can find, but there was no accountability for them. And I think where I get nervous is in the run-up to the Iraq War and in the prosecution of the Iraq War, I was very vocal and sometimes cursed about that. But the mainstream view, the New York Times, was they have weapons of mass destruction. They have these tubes that can only be used for nuclear war. Saddam Hussein is this, he's that. Couldn't I have gone down and fallen down this if Viacom or Comedy Central had wanted to censor me or had wanted to take me off the platform? Look, I'm not owed a platform. Nobody is. So it's not a First Amendment issue. It's not any of that. We're really, once you're in bed with a corporation, the deal is they have to sell enough beer and you get to do what you want. Right. But my point is, these are shifting sands. And I think I get concerned with, well, who gets to decide what that, I mean, in the Iraq War, I was on the side of what you would think on the mainstream is misinformation. I was promoting what they would call misinformation. But it turned out to be right years later, and the establishment media was wrong. And not only were they wrong, in some respects, you could make the case that they enabled a war that killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people and never paid a price for it and never had accountability, and just having an ombudsman print a retraction, to me, is an accountability. So it's very easy to attack Rogan, and I'm not saying that that's not your right and that there aren't things there to talk about. But what I'm saying is, let's be careful.
And so I thought that was a great little speech. And I think you really see Stewart here in the sense-making space where I see David Fuller and the Rebel Wisdom people trying to tread. Because if anything, the space has gotten more difficult and more challenging since the second Iraq War than it did since the time of the second Iraq War. And Stewart is right that in many ways these we've got the we've definitely got the majority narrative or the blue church narrative or the blob narrative, which had all sorts of doctrine around it and dogma. And of course, in time, a lot of that dogma tends to have to creep its way back. The difficulty is that we don't make decisions in hindsight. We make decisions in real time. And so this sense making, this trying to figure out what is true, what is right, and more importantly, how to act is vital. Now, a big part of this is also sort of the participatory nature of, say, we're watching the Ukrainian war now. We have this sense where, well, I have to right now take a side. Now, with respect to COVID, one has to decide, well, vax or no vax, mask or no mask, stay at home or don't stay at home, keep the church open or close the church. All of these decisions you sort of have to make on the fly, and there are going to be upsides and downsides, opportunities and consequences depending on which decision you make. Well, that's sort of life. But, one of the things that I always appreciated about Stewart was he had the honesty to ask the question. And here pointing out, oh yeah, you go after poor Joe Rogan about COVID stuff, but on one hand, Joe Rogan just pretty much identifies himself as, he says, I'm just a monkey talking to people, and I'm trying to figure stuff out. And in that sense, especially in the age of authenticity, Joe Rogan is sort of one of us. Because we're all watching, and now Joe Rogan has a bigger reach and he can get experts on because he's got this massive platform. But part of the reason Joe Rogan is so popular is we're all sort of sitting in the same space that Joe Rogan is sitting.
Because the sands can shift.
Yeah. People are in a new information ecosystem, and they're trying their best. But that's the thing about these platforms over the years is that we've asked no accountability from them. They're not built by librarians who are actual.
And what's amazing is Stewart just made the point. The New York Times, and we're not talking the New York Times sort of fighting for its existence in the internet age as much. This is the New York Times with ombudsmen and editors and all of the blue church machinery, went down the WMD trail and then just switched around. I mean, I just recently saw, the New York Times finally made a mention of Hunter Biden's laptop. And, frankly, during the election, I didn't pay a lot of attention to Hunter Biden's laptop. But, now suddenly, it was his. Yeah, there's stuff there. And, there we are.
Stewards of information. And so it's taken us a long time, at least the last decade, to get into the moment where we ask more from these companies. We're asking, we want access to the truth. We want it to come up first. We want more public interest content.
And now it's interesting, and there's some other really interesting conversations that he has with some interesting people about this question. We want access to the truth. Okay, well, during COVID, was someone covering it up? maybe someone was. And I'm sure there are plenty of people covering up bunches of different little truths. But what's interesting is, again, sort of how you can use religious language to filter all of this, stuff.
And so someone like Rogan really straddles the line because he reaches so many people, and he described it as a juggernaut. It's out of his control now. But really, it's not. It is in his control. It's well within Spotify's control.
So that's kind of the idea then, is, because what I was saying is, I'm generally more concerned about the algorithm than I am about the individual. Because if the algorithm can earn your trust, it will place you into places that, you assume that there's a gatekeeper. It's sort of like the news. When it's in the New York Times, you assume that there is a gatekeeper there that has vetted.
Now, of course, your assumption about the gatekeeper and the degree to which you trust that gatekeeper is going to vary. Now, maybe if it's in the New York Times, you assume that it's propaganda and a lie, but these things sort of twist both ways. Another area of this is, again, to what degree is the New York Times a principality, a constructed individual that, of course, goes down and has its own spiritual forces within it?
This. But in reality, our modern media is kind of an information laundering system, where the information comes from gets laundered through the aggregation process or the clickbait process or any of that. And
now what he's talking about here is very much what B.J. Campbell is talking about here, that what finally gets presented to us and our participation in it is not at all looking like the old model of gatekeeper transmission. My professor at Calvin Seminary, used to call it, and I've got it, darn dyslexia. I don't remember if it's jug to mug or mug to jug, but basically from my jug to your mug, we're just passing information. Well, that's not really what any of this is like.
Gossip and rumor become truth and fact, become canon very quickly.
Well, this is interesting because if you think about the history of the internet, the early websites that were really popular, Perez Hilton, right? People were here for gossip and rumor. They weren't here for the truth.
Right.
News was actually really slow to get online. Especially
Dr. Donovan.
It's part of the infrastructure of the internet itself. So to be in this moment where we're demanding more truth means that these platforms are becoming institutions, right? Like the New York Times, in a way, where people are asking them to be more accountable to the audiences that they claim to serve.
Now, again, accountable to the audiences that they claim to serve. Well, in a lot of ways, and again, Rebel Wisdom has covered this quite a bit, they are accountable to the audiences that they've claimed to serve, and one might call it audience capture.
And the Neil Young part of this is really interesting because tied up within it, and very little is talked about, is a labor dispute about Rogan getting $100 million and musicians getting, a penny for 350 plays.
Oh, wow.
And so within Neil Young's
So there's also an economic aspect
twist
to this that's very different.
Exactly.
And if you listen to other tech podcasts, I mean, that's been a known quantity. I mean, musicians got nearly zilch from radio play, and then with Pandora, Pandora was then competing with radio, and so musicians basically make almost no money from streaming music unless they're way up on the Pareto distribution.
And a lot of it gets brought up, in the moment where Neil Young just is like a catalyst for a bunch of different grievances that have been happening in the background, particularly about Rogan, but then also about Spotify having to stand on its 2 feet and say, this is what we are. So
now what's interesting about that is this gets again back to the whole speed of the conversation, where, of course, when Neil Young said, pull my music from Spotify, everyone's like, as if Neil Young's music and Joe Rogan's content are apples to apples, when in fact the cost, the economic impact of Neil Young pulling his music from Spotify is almost nothing. And Spotify has a lot better understanding of just, well, no, we're going to protect Joe Rogan because we know exactly how much, we know exactly what we're doing. And again, part of what Spotify is doing and trying to do through Joe Rogan, they're very much in competition with Apple, because audio podcasts are one of the last remaining free areas of the internet where all you need is an RSS feed and a podcast aggregator, and you can get it. Unlike something that is much more of a closed ecosystem like YouTube, where YouTube can just cut you off, or like the Babylon Bee on Twitter can just cut you off. It's much more difficult to shut off a podcast, because all you need is a server out there on the internet with an IP address, and you can get your podcast out. It's very difficult to shut it down as long as you can get server space on the internet.
So there's been allegations of racism with Rogan, COVID misinfo, of course, that Neil Young talks about.
And again, all of this allegations of racism. All you need to do is make an allegation of racism that, oh, Joe Rogan is a racist. And I don't know anybody who's watched Joe Rogan and said, well, Joe Rogan is a racist. Well, he certainly doesn't appear to be a racist in any area of his life. No, he's one of those kinds of racists that doesn't know he's a racist. And those are the worst kinds of all.
There's also lots of people that believe Rogan is anti-transgender, right? And has his own opinions about trans people in sports.
How dare he have his own opinions about anything?
But where is the platform at equal volume that allows trans people to counterweight what Rogan is saying, right?
And that argument is just hysterical, because, yeah, there's nobody out there speaking for trans people.
So there's something happening in the information ecosystem where we went from platforms that were supposed to serve people.
Don't you think that ended years and years ago? Because I would point to, let's use this as an example.
And again, she absolutely never addressed Jon Stewart's point about WMDs and the New York Times. Woof, it was gone.
Let's say you're the Simpsons, right?
Mm-hmm. All of the Simpsons.
All of the Simpsons. You're Lisa,
okay,
Bart,
I'm Lisa,
Homer.
though. I'm Lisa.
All right. I'm Homer.
You can be Homer. Okay, yeah, I knew what was coming.
You're on Fox, right? The same people that pay you pay Hannity. What is your responsibility? You know, when you say, where's the platform of equal voice? That's the fairness doctrine, not for politics, but for social issues, right? But we've never had that. And as an artist, what's your responsibility to the tube that you're in and the company that you're on? And I struggle with that. Like, I don't know what you do with that. Like, do we now expect the Simpsons to say we will no longer be a part of this company? Or like, how far do we go with that?
It's a big question right now. And I think we're moving from culture wars to content wars, in the sense that the way in which these fragmented, fringy opinions start to bubble up and coalesce online makes it seem like there's a lot more people with the same ideas.
Yeah,
right?
like there were a lot of people that thought Lady Gaga should have gotten an Oscar nom, and that's not the case.
It's not.
Not the case at all. And that's innocent.
Leave Lady Gaga out of this.
I just want to point out very quickly, that's at J. Jordan.
I would rather think about it not from the perspective of being an artist or a comedian, but from the perspective of owning a technology company. Well, what do you do? How do you protect and provide safety for your audiences or your customers? Which
That's interesting.
By and large, the customers are advertisers. The users are like the rows of cabbage that just get harvested, right? Like me and you are inconsequential individually.
Doctor, did you just refer to me as a row of cabbage?
I mean, you're just being, you're being cultivated.
I think just a single cabbage.
A single head of cabbage.
Yeah, you're just one cabbage. Yeah.
Listen, I'm a sociologist, and it's an old reference to sociological theory by Weber, where it's, it really
you don't
depends
have to explain
upon.
to us, Doctor.
We all know.
We know Weber.
You know Weber.
I didn't know
would.
this was a freshman course. Yeah.
But the idea here is pretty simple, which is to say that if you're a technology company, there's been all this confusion about what a platform is. A platform can mean a place from which to speak. A platform can mean a political agenda. And a platform now can mean a computational infrastructure that delivers content. And so that designation of a platform is something that we're going to argue about, because we're going to say, is it the responsibility of the person who's speaking to be responsible to these audiences, or are we going to say it's the computational infrastructure, the actual technology itself?
Now notice how that's depersonalized, the computational infrastructure, the technology itself. Again, what we're bumping into is that the modern framing is increasingly insufficient to handle the agency and how it is moving through people and populations. That language game, that imaginary, is insufficient to clearly represent what the world is looking like in this age.
And what's interesting about the New York Times example is the New York Times would put the burden or the onus of disinformation on the sources and say these are the people who are most responsible. And we've seen very similar things with Facebook, where they're saying, well, we don't know what's traveling on this crazy super highway of information. We don't know where it goes. We don't. And then,
except, of course, the New York Times does have editors and an editorial board. And so when during the Iran-Iraq War, the New York Times just passed along, well, what was given to it by Colin Powell and by the Bush administration, well, just out it went. And of course, it was interesting that in some ways, that episode broke Jon Stewart of his blind trust in the Times, and the fact that the Bush administration did it broke Rod Dreher of his blind trust in the conservative movement.
then you see something like Stop the Steal happen, and you're like, if not for your technology, these groups never would have been able to get aligned and meet and plan.
And again, I think that's just folly. I think that is completely wrong, because you can go back 100 years to the run-up of the Spanish-American War and see the whole thing just done. Now, of course, it was done with telegraphs and newspapers, but you still moved the needle.
And so you are culpable or responsible or accountable for these actions. And that's really why we have to understand these platforms as doing the organization and the coordination of things that happen from the wires to the weeds. And it's really important that we understand that.
So what is our vetting system for this? Is it crowdsourcing? Wikipedia to some extent does that. But, is the answer the blockchain of information?
God, no.
That would be wrong.
She's terrified of blockchain because, of course, blockchain much more radically both democratizes and validates. It's verifiable. It's right there. It's hard to take down and push away.
I have just failed out of the doctor's class.
It's slow, and it's reactionary in the sense that what we need to do is actually stem the flow and the tide of the damage that an individual or small groups of people can do. And
in other words, what's interesting, keep the blue church, the blob institutions there. Stop the technological disruption of, and what's so amazing is that all of this talk about power, there's the power of the New York Times, the power of all of these corporations. No, we've got to stop this democratizing of access to, as if your uncle's Facebook tweet, boy, he's sure sound like an old man with that one, as if your uncle's Facebook post is going to be seen by millions of people, and that your uncle's cousins and nieces and nephews that didn't like what he posted haven't already either muted or unfriended your uncle.
And this is where the problem of platforming really comes in, because if you are able to distribute your information to millions and millions of people.
Now, it's important to see, and I'll try and grab now, where does she work? The Harvard Kennedy School, Shorenstein Center on Media and Public Policy. Yeah, can't have these platforms out there. You're sitting atop one of the biggest platforms of all in American culture.
And you have no responsibility to what the aftermath is. The true costs are then paid by...
No responsibility to Jon Stewart made that point to her 15 minutes ago. Just whoosh. No responsibility for the aftermath. It was an entire war. And, America came in and destroyed Iraq, and, you can argue about parallels perhaps between Russia and Ukraine and America and Iraq and Saddam Hussein. We, of course, were quite a bit more skilled, and I think perhaps, people can argue with this, a little bit more, the elephants tried to tiptoe through its shock and awe. But, we're gonna continue to believe this.
By journalists that have to debunk it. The true costs are paid by academics that have to research it. And then down the line, anybody who might be harmed by believing, that you can treat COVID with some kind of bleach or light therapy. And so what's important is that we think about platforming differently in terms of the scale. And one of the things that I've really advocated for is that we reduce the scale and the speed by which information travels, so as to be able to do as what you're suggesting is to have some kind of
these are spirits at war. Oh, we have to reduce what the platforms that we can't control are conveying. Oh, I see.
Crowdsourced intervention, or not to let information scale to a huge amount of people before we can actually have any evidence that it's true or false. And this is like misinformation that ends up leading us to a run on the grocery stores where there's no toilet paper, and we're like,
or the run on the Canadian banks where the prime minister is threatening to freeze funds of anybody who associated with a certain group of people who drive large things with wheels on them.
Like, why are we having a toilet paper shortage? And it's because people are reading that, there's going to be a military call to arms and and everything's getting shut down. Again, it's happening again. Get toilet.
Now, I want to go to Ben Shapiro and Bill Maher, because something was said in there that I thought was so critical, and I think I can probably play that. Well, maybe I'll just do it the same way and just be careful.
Right. There's a lot of silliness on both sides, a lot of bad information on both sides. I don't think the liberals liked it when I pointed out that I think it was something like 41% of Democrats, when asked the question, and this was in the New York Times, they had Republican versus Democrat views on COVID, and something like 41% of Democrats, when asked the key question, how many people who get COVID need to be hospitalized, thought it was over 50%, when it was, of course, around 1%. That's a crazy number to be off that much about the... No wonder they think you need a mask everywhere. If you think half the people who get it need to go to the hospital and it's really 1%, how did they get that bad information in their head?
Right there. How did they get that bad information in their head? And I would dare bet that the media sources didn't tell them 40%. How did they get that information? They didn't get information in their head. They were watching and responding, and they made up numbers and guesses like that in their head because they were looking at basically just how anxious, the anxiety that the media was communicating by the way it communicates. We think people are direct. You think, well, you give people data and they remember the data. Oh no, we're picking up a lot of signals and we're making up a lot of the data as we're reading the signals.
So one thing you learn in TV news when you're writing headlines and copy and things like that are you want to use phrases as opposed to like sentences that have subject, verb, subject, verb. So like a tree crashed is not an interesting sentence. You want to say trees crashing. Yeah.
Active.
You want to, it's active language.
As though it's happening right now.
Correct. And you also want to start every sentence with tonight. So if you look at every package in an evening news broadcast, and quite frankly, cable too, it'll all start with tonight, trees crashing.
Oh.
Yeah.
My heart sank.
Do you feel that?
Yeah.
Isn't this basically the definition of what Vervaeke talks about with BSing? You can say all the correct words, but as long as you intimate to our receptors, tonight, trees crashing, tonight, COVID danger, tonight, right now, today, horrible. Participate. Do it now. Stand up for Ukraine. Protect these people. Advocate for them. This is the truth. What is the truth? Bill Maher said it right there. I doubt any news source actually gave disinformation or misinformation, and especially with written media. That's part of the reason why written and read media is a little less dangerous than this. Sense making. Now back to the generational aspect of Jon Stewart. This particular video was again, the retrospective on him, which I found actually quite enlightening. Now, he lists Stewart as Gen X. He's born in 62. He's sort of right there in the boundary waters, but these boundary waters contain a lot of interesting people. The Weinsteins, a little bit young, but in there. I don't know where John Vervaeke is. I should ask him one of these days how old he is. He's got to be around this same age. Peterson. There's something about this time period that the 60s boomer counterculture generation was really split between the establishment and then the new hippie rebels. And someone who was born in my generation, we were young enough to watch the end of the hippie era, and we're old enough to have seen the end of the Vietnam era, and we watched the Second Gulf War, and now, of course, Afghanistan is done. And so Jon Stewart, what was he about? And I thought this retrospective was good, and now he's going to start summarizing some things.
And that's for another video. This is only the beginning of my war on Gen X. My point here is that Jon Stewart, like many Gen X comedians, bristled at looking like he cared too much. Those are the absurd people Stewart mocks. He can't become one. It's this cynicism, the belief that caring that much makes you an unserious fanatic or bad faith political actor, that drove Stewart.
But what's funny is that Stewart still cares. And so now, even after the end of The Daily Show, and now he comes back on Apple TV, he cares about sense making, and he's still in the game. And so, to the establishment woman from Harvard, she's like, oh, it's social media lacks accountability. Yeah, well, what about the New York Times?
Stewart used hypocrisy baiting and focused on semantics in order to poke holes in that posturing, to expose the theater of it all. But leaves no room for actual belief.
If your product is just flogging hypocrisy and making people laugh about it, then the opposite of your product is idealism and somebody trying to, like, it's that war between that deep need to believe and the deep need to believe that the need to believe is bullshit.
Steve believes Stewart's hypocrisy baiting has a lot in common with something writer David Foster Wallace observed way back in 2000 when he shadowed the John McCain campaign. Foster Wallace described, quote, a very American sort of confusion, a sort of interior war between your deep need to believe and your deep belief that the need to believe is bull, that there's nothing left anywhere but salesmen.
There's a good bit of meaning crisis right in there.
And I think that I agree that this interior war is something we can see in Stewart's ideology. And I think it's part of what made The Daily Show resonate so strongly. There was and still is a deep skepticism amongst liberals and the political left that American politics can produce a functioning government. Anyone can see that it's theater, that politicians and pundits are just hypocritical salesmen. They break promises, they contradict each other, and they shamelessly brand talking points as the spin zone.
After the debates, where do you guys head to right afterward?
Home.
No, Spin Alley.
What are you talking about? I mean, at these debates?
Yeah, you go to Spin Alley, the place called Spin Alley.
Mm-hmm.
Now, don't you think that for people watching at home, that's kind of a drag, that you're literally walking to a place called Deception Lane?
Americans...
Now, again, Stewart hasn't changed that much. He's still in the sense-making. And since, I think, since the Iraq War, he's still trying to ask, can we know the truth? Now, Stewart clearly has his own sense of religion. Now, Stewart, of course, he actually, in The Daily Show, I remember some of his skeptical pieces that were quite sharp and quite good about Jesus and Christianity and faith. And so he clearly seems like an atheist, but he is a holder of this establishment Protestantism that is still asserting itself through the system, even as it's sort of being deconstructed by a religious system that only finds its orientation deep down inside each one of us.
Despite all evidence to the contrary, aren't dumb. We can tell that they're lying. So having Stewart lay out very clear examples of how they were lying scratched a very definite itch. The Daily Show turned that demoralizing experience into absurdist theater.
Saturday marked the second anniversary of the invasion of Iraq by coalition forces. The second anniversary, so many memories. As you know, the country was secured a scant 3 weeks later, and the 98 weeks since then have been one long victory celebration. The good times. Remember that explosion? That was a good one. And that explosion. And that guy. Good times. And they said it wouldn't last. Seriously, they said it wouldn't last.
I actually think there's a pretty strong parallel to be drawn between The Daily Show and The Soup, a clip show hosted by Joel McHale that focused primarily on pop culture, local TV news, and reality TV on E! They'd play a clip, cut to McHale, who would make a face while the audience laughed at the absurdity of the clip, and then he'd hit you with a joke.
Two Asian girls over there, and they're nodding their heads.
They're nodding their heads laughing or saying it's not funny?
It was funny.
You thought it was funny? I love you! There you go! All right.
You see, she doesn't hate Asian people. She just let two of them into her studio to agree with her.
The joke on The Soup was always the absurdity of pop culture performance, and the joke on The Daily Show was always the absurdity of political performance. I don't disagree that political theater is absurd, but beneath it all, there is a material impact. Political policy affects people's lives. It can create or destroy a social safety net, raise or lower taxes, expand or restrict voting power, etc., etc. There's a million things. Politics isn't just reality TV for ugly people. At its worst, this...
He just said it wasn't, but he sure gave me the idea that it is.
Styling of comedy could be seen as nihilistic therapy. Well, it's all bullshit anyway, so who cares? And for me, this was the fundamental misstep of the rally to restore sanity. Its attendance focused so intently on laughing at the absurdist theater of politics and congratulating themselves for being above it all that it was totally removed from reality.
And this is sort of where we get back into the meaning crisis and how it comes around to a new age of earnestness. And you can only found that earnestness on this sense of certainty. But what if you're still in the sense-making space?
Just days before the rally to restore sanity, John Boehner, the soon-to-be Speaker of the House, said this about President Obama's agenda. Quote, "We're going to do everything, and I mean everything we can do, to kill it, stop it, slow it down, whatever we can." Minority Leader Mitch McConnell told National Journal, quote, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." In the words of Alex Shepard, writing a retrospective for The New Republic in 2019, quote, "The idea that the left has enemies who must be roundly defeated remains too gauche for many Democrats. That disdain for political combat is all on display at the rally to restore sanity, but coated with smug condescension. It's elaborate political theater that nominally appeals to better angels, but really signals that the liberals are smarter and gentler than conservatives, and that deep down, the rest of the country agrees with them."
Can you see how the times have changed?
Just over a week after the rally, Democrats were crushed in the midterms, breaking their supermajority. Over the rest of Obama's presidency, Republicans would hold a record-setting number of filibusters, obstructing as much as they possibly could and grinding the federal government to a halt.
I remember your march, I think it was against insanity or something along those lines.
Yeah, we won.
Well,
and this is the issue with Stewart's hyperfixation on hypocrisy and messaging. His appeal to rationality. When it came time to stake his claim and commit to the ideas beneath that partisan theater, Stewart couldn't do it. All he had was a belief that liberal politics were rational, that radical centrism was the default. Those wackos in Occupy Wall Street, they've just been warped by the theater of us versus them. Once we all
Can you just see the modernity and all of this taking place in here? Rationality, and now we're going to hit it with that old Gen Xer.
We all realize that we're Americans. Moderate liberal politics are sure to be the only reasonable choice that everyone can get behind.
You may lack the theatrical flair necessary for today's 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week news media. You may have an assault rifle, but don't think it's appropriate to bring to a rally filled with your unarmed citizen brethren. You may be interested in a topic, but not dress all in pink, cover your hands in fake blood, and act like you snuck into a meeting that's public in the first place interested.
Mobilizing 200,000 largely liberal people only to have Democrats be roundly defeated in the 2010 midterms by a party intent to obstruct any kind of policy whatsoever probably should have felt like a demoralizing failure.
But you could turn on The Daily Show, laugh about the sad state of democracy, and go to bed having experienced some small catharsis. It's a kind of defense mechanism of girding ourselves against the darkest parts of our political theater. Here's Steve again.
People on the left take the other position, not to get outraged and have that righteous anger misplaced onto people of color or poor people. That's what the right does. The left sort of says, oh, this is so depressing. This is such a bummer. Let me see if I can have Jon Stewart be my champion, or John Oliver, whoever, and at least I'll see there's one person who sees it as I do and who can make me laugh about something that rightfully should both make me cry and also have me on the streets in a full rage with a sign, saying pharmaceutical executives should be treated most properly in The Hague. And in a way, the left is hungry for that, because underneath all of our sniggering and laughter is a deep heartbreak that somehow government is no longer a force for good in the lives of people, that it can't get even basic stuff done. It can't get a budget passed, let alone protecting, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. So,
did you catch that? Where's that from? Isn't that something you hear in church all the time? That's what government's for.
Stewart is the person, in my discombobulated formulation of it, who comes along and is able to say to people like you, you're probably somewhere in your 20s or 30s, hey, all that noise in Washington, D.C., I'm going to give you that in like 20 minutes a night, and you'll laugh, and you'll be able to sort of deal with the fact that your generation is inheriting a totally dysfunctional democracy and government that is probably going to lead the species to the brink. And that's kind of too heavy for you. So let me do it in 20 minutes with lots of laughs.
lot of Game B-ism in there, isn't there? We're heading to the brink, we're going down, and Jon Stewart is just keeping us laughing. I think you want something more.
The problem with that, though? Don't we deserve that kind of release? Is it so bad to be entertained and educated at the same time? A common critique of The Daily Show from the left is that its very structure generated cynicism and apathy. By reducing political dysfunction to entertainment, it trivialized it. Something that we should react to with deep moral outrage, the argument goes, was turned into a joke. All that was asked of its audience was to show up, whether that was each night to a Mesopotamia segment or to the rally to restore sanity and/or fear. This train of thought can be traced back to influential writer and critic Neil Postman and
wow, where it all began on my channel.
His book Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985. He claimed that television was inherently focused on presentation rather than understanding, and thus everything that was filtered through a TV screen was reduced to entertainment.
They go back and they say, look, if satire could do anything, then the satirists in Nazi Germany would have made a difference, or the satirists in Russia, Putin's Russia, lots of satire, like that would have made a difference, and blah, blah. This is that sort of classic left liberal, left progressive, doesn't really matter, curmudgeonly, like, this can't be good because, the revolution hasn't happened. The facts are really different.
But what if I told you that the science of satire indicates that actually it isn't just entertainment? What if I told you that satire fosters cynicism, but not apathy? That cynicism can actually be a powerful force in activism and politics? That Jon Stewart hasn't really changed, but that those activating forces moved his audience beyond his radical centrism? That we don't need him anymore?
We don't need him anymore. That Jon Stewart, he was good for when we were a little baby, but now we're all ready to go out there and change the world. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Stewart and the Ukrainian war, because it's not the U.S. this time that is breaking someone else's country. It's Russia. And how do we make sense of this? Where do we go with this? This is a little interesting take on Newsroom blaming the audience, and it reminded me of the producers blaming the audience. Well, let's start at the beginning.
Media provides a morphine drip for these producers to keep them like, okay, we're in the zone. This is what the people want.
They're following social media. They're actually on Twitter and Facebook going, what are these people up in arms about?
That's right. And they can say in a meeting, oh, this is really clicking today. This is really going. This got about. Holy croak, no, you can see a television news story in which people are like, this idiot said this about this idiot on Twitter, and they treat it like it's a whole news story. So it has permeated the thinking in very profound ways, and it's made us dumber.
I really like that you use the expression holy crocono. It is an expression I've never heard, and I will be adding it to my vocabulary to replace fuck. But it strikes me that Fox wouldn't be as, that's a dog news-wise. It's more like that doesn't fit our audience's bloodlust.
I think the two things go to the same end in this way. Fox is I was there for 10 years. When I started in a news division meeting, if you talked about the ratings, it would have been gross. By the time I left, I heard producers and people in the news division talking openly about ratings this, ratings that.
Did they get the minute by minutes?
Some people, and that actually, the diffusion of those reports changed over time, and it became much more ratings driven.
So basically what the news is saying to us is, this isn't our fault, it's your fault. They are outsourcing the responsibility of news gathering and news telling to, well, if they would watch better stuff, we'd show them that.
But that's not the audience.
They're connected.
But that's not the audience. That's someone's view of the audience, right? There's someone in an office who says, listen, young people, I guess that means...
No, I understand that, but it takes a long time to figure out what the audience wants. And when I first started at The Daily Show, right, they were really on us to do a lot of pop culture shit. And this was my last shot in TV, and I knew it. I was 35, I'd been down the road a ton. And what I said to them was, let's make a deal. Let me do the thing that I believe in. And if it sucks, and it doesn't sell you enough beer, you can fire me. In other words, we developed a thing that we believed in, and the audience showed up. Rather than doing research on what the audience wanted and backing into it. And there are so many good, talented, passionate journalists that are getting the life sucked out of them by a system that is backwards. Is that correct?
It's very interesting there where the journalists are sort of the priests of the new order.
Let me throw out a different narrative on this.
Holy crocono, it's about time.
You know, I think what this is really about is a lack of courage of changing the model. The part about the minute by minutes, you're looking at data that is already incredibly flawed from the beginning. And the more you...
What data? Where do they get their data?
Well, Nielsen provides ratings for most broadcast products.
Nielsen?
Yeah.
The group from the 50s with the book that you write in.
Well, and the main theory behind their methodology hasn't changed any. In the 70s and 80s, when you had the dials and there was 5 options, it worked pretty well. Now look at what's happening. You have hyper-fragmentation. You have people consuming content all the time on all kinds of different devices and platforms, and it just hasn't kept up. So now you take that data, you start splicing it down to minute by minute. You take bad data, make it smaller and focus. You got nothing.
How in their right mind has nobody stepped back and said, you know, Nielsen ratings are often written on papyrus?
At some point, you just start realizing, I wonder if what we're looking at is any degree of realism at all.
I think it's about systems. Like, well, listen, I'm in this system, and this is how the system is, and if I would like to get paid, continue to be paid the money that I'm making, which is seriously good money, do I really want to fight the system? I think for most of the journalists working there when I was there, they loved journalism, as I did and I do. But I think, you know, the mission was to do the best work that you could do and win. You know, win is in the ratings, win.
Win. But what does winning look like? You know, our religion sort of pulls us into the future. We have a vision of this is what will happen when the world is set right. And I think to sort of set Stewart apart and say, well, he doesn't have a vision and he doesn't believe that we can really seize the future and go into it. Maybe he's a little bit wiser because he's a little bit older and says, well...
is making sure that you're getting picked up by the New York Times. Win is not about educating the public. It's not so complicated.
Educating the public. And now, again, you see this back and forth between the public and, well, and Stewart's kind of like, oh, it's their passion. That's sort of the internal, the secret, sacred self that's leading the way. Watch The Bachelor. If I only listened to my heart. Well, I don't know, Clayton, you listened to your heart and you fell in love with 3 girls at the same time. Doesn't surprise me.
Real Housewives is a really good model, the reality show, right? This idea, the person who's willing to go there, go over the top, they become better known, they get paid more money, it's successful. Your guests who are willing to go over the top, the person who's willing to say the thing no one's willing to say, that person is good TV. If they're good TV, then they're gonna get booked.
Well, cable's moved to opinion. You know, what's the difference between opinion and what's the news? Locals never gotten into that game. And thank God, I think it's one of the things that's going to save us in the end.
Local news has not really done what cable news has made an art out of, right? Which is the chaos as good TV. Local news has to.
Local news doesn't do chaos as good TV. If it bleeds, it leads on local news.
To serve the people watching, they have to cover the community. So they can't just have 2 people screaming at each other for 4 minutes and say, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Now, this was one of the most interesting with with Paul Iger, former CEO of Disney. Well, why are we getting the news from Walt Disney? Well, we're getting the news from ABC, perhaps.
Let me explain to you why we're here. First of all, no one else would talk to us, so thank you. So we spoke with a lot of heads of news divisions, and they are reluctant to speak on the record. Do you have an idea of why they might be so reluctant to speak publicly?
Well, I think that news organizations, there's a sense that they are being scrutinized and being criticized in a way that they've never experienced before. And I think there's a bit of a bunker mentality that has set in. I think it's very, very hard when you're constantly being criticized by...
That doesn't happen to regular people on social media.
Who would criticize the news? Who would do such a thing? That's terrible. All right, it's my fault. But you know what's interesting? The people that we talked to would all say, well, you know, you gotta deliver the ratings. They call them the minute-to-minutes, right? How much of it is the ratings pressure, and how much of it is a self-consciousness over accusations of liberal bias or accusations of a political agenda? What concerns would they express to you in that situation?
Accusations of a liberal bias or a political agenda. Those aren't real. Nobody has biases or agendas.
ABC News reported to me in one form or another for probably 35 years, 30 some odd years. And my advice to them was to not hear the noise as much, to continue doing the job that we've entrusted them to do, which is to tell the truth, to state the facts, to present the news in an accurate and a fair and in a timely basis. But we never sought to drive ratings or even bottom line success at the sacrifice of what we consider to be quality. It wasn't part of our discussion.
What they will tell you, and maybe they didn't say it, you know, in those meetings, is the producer of the piece will be cognizant of the minute-to-minute ratings. The executive producer of the show will be cognizant of those. And the decisions that they make were almost entirely built on what they thought might have rated.
I mean, if you're asking whether there have been incidents when news organizations fail to carry things because they don't think they'll be of interest to their audience, I'm sure that's the case.
No, I'm not saying instances. I'm saying that's been shaping.
You think it's a regular thing.
And not told in the right way.
Should know about it not being, see, that's yes. I would argue that there are stories that are not told because there's a belief that people aren't interested in them. I don't think there are stories that are told inaccurately just to make them more interesting to people.
It's not inaccurate.
I'm defending an organization as opposed to news in general.
Right.
I just don't have enough.
But trust in news during the Cronkite era was one of the most valued institutions. Today, it's somewhere between Congress and herpes, you know, in terms of its Q rating. What happened?
It starts with technology enabling an explosion of programming, which includes news and information. And with that, I believe, has come a dilution in quality. The more volume, typically, as it grows and grows and grows and explodes, results in my opinion, a loss of quality. And then you look...
Which is so interesting because you might say, well, in a free market, actually, volume and multiplicity of vendors and manufacturers would produce an increase in quality. Well, I guess it depends if you're General Motors and Toyota is the young upstart.
Look at what is presented as news on social media, and you can immediately conclude that a lot of what is presented that people think is news is not news as certainly we knew it when we were growing up and what we were taught news should be. So I think what people believe is news is really opinion, and opinion is very different than that. Opinion is a bias.
But you're in a business where the first word you say, the first thing you say at the top of every broadcast is, our top story tonight. That's...
combinatorial explosiveness. How many things are... all the news that's fit to print. Really? That's pretty audacious.
Opinion. It's subjective. There's this strange disconnect between the high-mindedness of what they say they do, democracy dies in darkness, versus the reality of how they produce it.
breaking news tonight, everyone will die, watch us, because their business model is based on engagement.
It is an editorial decision.
Attention.
To decide what story to tell first. But you're suggesting that that in itself is an example of a lessening of quality or a
It's bias. If you don't admit, I'll give you an example. If you lead every night with the Mueller report, the Mueller investigation, they created a television show. They created the OJ trial out of the Mueller report. That business model, it feels like, overwhelms whatever journalistic credibility exists. And isn't that what needs to be fixed?
I do believe that many news organizations feeling embattled by the Trump and the Trump era reacted to it, perhaps by building up his potential demise. In other words, I think there was almost a glee felt.
If that were a singular example, right? When we withdrew forces from Afghanistan, there was, appropriately enough, a pretty big focus on it.
Big story.
Very big story.
Should have been a lot of focus on it.
I think you're absolutely right. But the focus on it was one of high dudgeon over how could this happen and why did it happen and what's going on. But we'd been there since 2000 and
20-year war, right?
Isn't some of the context of what happened based on no one covering it in a significant way over the past 10 years?
Well, you're suggesting it had been covered on a regular basis, then we wouldn't have been surprised by the speed at which the Taliban took over the country as we drew down our forces?
So I'm saying if it had been covered more,
right,
maybe we wouldn't even have been there that long. What I'm saying is that we are not well informed, that the news media goes...
Again, it's we. Oh. He's engaging with this question of, I don't think deep enough, but he's asking some good questions.
It was all or nothing on everything, that they're like 8-year-olds playing soccer. And if you've ever seen them...
Everybody running to the ball?
Everybody run to the ball. And that there's no perspective because...
So I could argue there are some stories that have not been covered enough. Maybe because there's a belief that the audience isn't interested in them. Maybe because even news organizations get tired of presenting them on a regular basis. Well, I don't know incidents of that.
You don't think that the outraged nature of the coverage was a bit overhyped?
I mean, the only thing I could argue is maybe if it had been covered more, America would have been more outraged earlier about the fact that we were there.
That's my point.
That maybe the pullout would have happened earlier. I don't know. I lived through the Vietnam era. Let's just say,
yes,
we'll conclude war is hell, right? Therefore,
yes,
if news organizations cover the hell, maybe we won't have wars.
When news narrows their focus of coverage, people get a skewed picture of what a reality is.
I think you're being a little too critical, in my opinion, of news overall. That's not to say that news organizations don't hype big stories, because many of them do, and sometimes overhype, sometimes to a fault. But
when do they not? I'd be more curious as to when you thought they didn't.
We'd have to go back to the biggest story of our time. COVID, was that overhyped? 900,000 people in the United States have died from it. Doesn't feel...
But which data do you look at? Bill Maher says, what percentage of people go to the hospital? Polling Democratic voters. 40%. Did anybody say 40%? No. They probably said accurately, if they said it all, but the message was there. And it came through strong.
Overhyped to me.
No. I'll give you an example with COVID that I think is apropos. Mask wearing. The political conflict over whether or not to wear masks. And the overwhelming majority of conversation is speculation about what that means to freedom and this person's anger about it. And so little of it is, what does it do? Why did surgeons wear them?
Well,
But
I think
the
that part of the
overwhelming
story
amount
was
of it-
told. Part of the story that was told already is that people should wear masks because there's, from a scientific perspective.
With science. And now, of course, so that's getting a lot of question now. Did the masks ever really help much of anything? But, you know, Saturday Night Live had a fun sketch on that.
There's a real reason to do so.
Right.
And I...
Right. Really? Didn't pause on that?
Their coverage of conflict hypes it. And I actually think they drive a lot of it.
So I guess if there's more and more incidents of people going crazy about mask wearing, I guess I could argue it should be covered. Now, if you're asking me whether I think there's probably been too much made of that, probably. I would probably...
Don't you think coverage can influence behavior? Can news influence behavior?
Isn't that the question? Isn't that the purpose of news? Isn't that, I mean, what are the journalists dying for? What is their sense of meaning in their vocation? They're trying to bring rightness to the world. Or are they trying to bring information so people can make their own decision? Or...
Sure, we can. Absolutely. Which is why I think it's so important for news to act responsibly. Look, it has just as much a power, just as it has a power to do good, it has a power to do bad.
What can be done to manage it more responsibly?
It's managed responsibly by some organizations, and by others, it's not. Look, people are not held accountable for inaccuracies, so there's that issue. And then there's the whole issue of profiting from, I'll call it inaccuracy. In other words, from opinion and from, well, presenting things in an inaccurate fashion. I think if you're looking at overall the pot of that isn't considered news today, it's a problem. So to answer your question, I don't know what the answer is in terms of fixing it.
Let's use Fox News as an example, because I think it's a good example. Roger Ailes had an idea. I don't know if you knew Roger at all.
Roger came to me and wanted to run ABC News at one point, before, believe it or not, in the early 90s.
Boy, that would have been a Trojan horse.
Yeah, we weren't looking for someone at that point.
Right.
So I wasn't in need, but I met with him.
It's really clear that he is advocating, or was advocating, a political position and used his storytelling ability and his narrative ability to create this powerhouse.
And of course, the question is, well, he's the only one doing this? Everyone isn't doing this? Don't you put your cards on the table to one degree or another? Or maybe, and how do you figure out, is it pre-chewed sense making, or do you give them something from which to make sense and you facilitate the process? I mean, again, and part of this sense making here isn't simply, you know, I want to wander over into journalism, but churches are the original sense-making institutions. Before the printing press, unless you lived in a major city, the church made sense for you. And the kinds of battles that are going on again and again, it's the church trying to make sense for people, to help people figure out the world, to give them information, but also to prioritize this information and to use a variety of ways, symbolism, narrative, worship, attention, all of this for sense-making, and sense-making that leads to the capacity to love one another. Where's this video going? I don't know. But over the weekend, listened to a bunch of these little videos and struck me the generational piece. Those of us who were born in the early to mid 60s, we saw Watergate as children, you know, not necessarily that young. I was Watergate, I was 11. We saw the 70s. We saw 9/11. We were fully adults by the second Iraq War. And now, again, I'm sort of waiting to see where Jon Stewart is going to go with this next conflict. He's sort of covering all of the issues and all of the ways of the issues that you would expect him to deal with from where he sits on the political spectrum. But yeah, sense making. Can we figure it out?